It was just another evening, cars lined up at a red light, people heading home. Jane was sitting in her car, waiting for the light to change, when something strange caught her attention. From the car next to hers, she heard terrified screams. Someone was begging for help. Then she saw it. A hand, small and frantic, banging against the backseat window. The driver, a man with a cold, blank stare, kept his eyes forward, gripping the wheel. But when he noticed Jane looking, he suddenly sped off, zigzagging through traffic until he was gone. Shaken, Jane grabbed her phone and called 911. She had no idea that what she had just witnessed was part of something much bigger, a horrifying crime that could have been stopped that very night. This is the tragic case of Denise Amber Lee. Denise Amber Lee grew up in Charlotte County, where she was raised in a loving household by her parents. From an early age, Denise cherished her family, showing her affection through small but meaningful acts of kindness. Though naturally shy, she had a warm personality and dreamed of finding her soulmate and starting a family of her own. In 2004, while attending high school, Denise met Nathan Lee. He was outgoing, popular, and athletic, often surrounded by friends, while Denise was quiet, studious, and known for her intelligence. She excelled in mathematics and spent hours immersed in books, earning a reputation as a bookworm. Despite their differences, Denise found herself drawn to Nathan, and one day, she bravely initiated a conversation with him. To her surprise, they quickly connected, and soon after, she invited him on a date. Their relationship blossomed, and just 3 weeks after their first date, they celebrated Valentine's Day together. Nathan gifted Denise a small heart-shaped ring worth $40, a symbol of their budding romance that she treasured deeply. Despite their contrasting personalities, they complemented each other perfectly. Their love grew quickly, and Nathan knew Denise was the one. In August 2005, they married, ready to build a life together. By 2006, Denise was pregnant with their first child, Noah, and a year later, they welcomed their second son, Adam. Denise embraced motherhood with devotion, choosing to stay home to care for her children, while Nathan worked multiple jobs to support their growing family. Despite financial struggles, their home was filled with love and hope. As their family expanded, they moved to a larger rental home in Northport, Florida, in late 2007. The neighborhood was still developing, but it offered the safety and comfort they desired. While Denise's father was initially hesitant about them moving farther away, he understood their need for a better living space. January 17, 2008, began like any other day for the Lee family. Nathan left for work while Denise stayed home with the boys. They remained in regular contact, and around 11 a.m., they spoke on the phone. Denise mentioned that she was giving one of the children a haircut, and since the weather was nice, Nathan suggested she turn off the air conditioning to save money and open the windows instead. She agreed, saying she had already done so. However, later that afternoon, when Nathan tried calling her again, she didn't answer. Growing increasingly concerned, he made multiple attempts to reach her during his 25-minute drive home. By the time he arrived at the house around 3 p.m., an unsettling scene awaited him. Denise's phone, purse, and keys were left on the table. The windows were closed, contradicting what she had told him earlier. Most disturbing of all, both children were in the same crib, something Denise never did. She was nowhere to be found. Nathan instantly knew something was terribly wrong. Denise would never leave their children alone. At 3:25 p.m., he called 911 to report her disappearance. This was the first emergency call related to her case. He then contacted his father-in-law, Rick, a seasoned sergeant with over 25 years of experience in law enforcement. Rick, aware of how missing persons cases were often dismissed initially, also knew that suspicion would likely fall on Nathan first. Determined to act swiftly, he used his influence to mobilize local officers. Within minutes, law enforcement officers from the county were deployed. By 4 p.m., they arrived at the Lee residence to investigate. A thorough inspection of the house revealed no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and no missing valuables, ruling out robbery. The lack of immediate clues left investigators puzzled. Their next step was to question the neighbors, hoping someone had seen or heard something unusual. Each person was asked to carefully go over their memories of that day and recount every little detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Investigators were desperate for any information that could help them unravel this strange case. That's when Jennifer Eckert, who was staying with relatives next door to the Lee family, stepped forward. She recalled that around 2 p.m., she had noticed a white man driving a dark green Camaro circling the neighborhood. After a few rounds, he finally pulled into Denise's driveway. Jennifer found this behavior suspicious, so before heading back inside, she made sure to get a good look at the man's face. About 10 minutes later, she stepped back out onto the porch and saw him leaving. However, she couldn't tell if anyone else was in the car with him. This observation proved crucial for detectives. They quickly relayed the information to their colleagues at the sheriff's office, providing a detailed description of the driver. Within hours, an alert was issued to law enforcement agencies in the area. Meanwhile, Denise was nowhere to be found. Her husband was overwhelmed with despair, feeling completely lost. Their children were too young to comprehend the gravity of the situation or the devastating impact it would have on their future. In desperation, he reached out to as many people as he could, pleading for help in the search for Denise. He even contacted journalists, hoping the media could amplify the case's visibility. And it worked. The story quickly gained traction, drawing attention from news outlets that had no idea just how far-reaching its impact would be. Then, at 6:14 p.m., the emergency dispatch center received an unexpected call. A woman was on the line for nearly 5 minutes, but instead of directly addressing the operator, she seemed to be speaking to someone else, begging them to take her home, pleading to be reunited with her family. At one point, she did ask the dispatcher for help, but most of her words were directed at the person holding her captive. The operator struggled to make sense of the call, but one critical detail finally connected it to Denise's disappearance. The woman managed to say that she had been taken against her will by a man she didn't know. Before the line abruptly cut off, she also provided one last crucial piece of information: the make of the car she was in. This detail confirmed the lead investigators had received earlier that day. Despite Denise's bravery and her desperate attempt to be saved, authorities couldn't track her location. The phone she had used belonged to her abductor, and it was a disposable device with no GPS capabilities. However, further investigation led them to a name: Michael Lee King. Michael, a 36-year-old man, lived just a short distance from Denise and her family. Born on May 4, 1971, he had spent most of his life in Michigan. As an adult, he married and had a child, but his marriage was troubled and ended in a bitter divorce. In 2002, he packed up and moved to Florida, where he worked as a plumber, until one day he simply quit for no apparent reason. From that point on, Michael struggled to hold down a job. Reports surfaced that he had been fired multiple times due to inappropriate behavior, particularly toward women. One disturbing incident involved him exposing himself to a woman who was breastfeeding her baby. She never reported it to the police. Those who knew Michael described him as an odd and troublesome individual. He frequented nudist clubs and often clashed with his neighbors due to his erratic actions. Some speculated that his behavior was linked to an intellectual disability. He had a significantly low IQ, and it was believed that a childhood accident, where he suffered a serious head injury while riding a sled, had contributed to his cognitive struggles. By 2007, Michael's life was unraveling. He had declared bankruptcy, was unemployed, and his home was on the brink of foreclosure. And now, Denise's life was in his hands. At 6:23 p.m., just 9 minutes after Denise's call and 3 hours after her disappearance was reported, Sarasota County authorities received another tip. This time, it came from a 17-year-old girl named Sabrina. She was the daughter of Harold, Michael's cousin. Sabrina, clearly shaken, told authorities she had overheard her father discussing something alarming. She insisted that her identity remain confidential. According to her, at around 6 p.m., her uncle Michael had shown up at Harold's house unexpectedly. He had asked to borrow a shovel, a gas can, and a flashlight. Sabrina also saw something that made her blood run cold. As Michael was about to leave, a woman suddenly emerged from his car, attempting to escape. But before she could get far, Michael grabbed her by the hair and dragged her back inside the vehicle. Alarmed, Harold questioned what was going on. Michael brushed it off, saying it was just a fight between him and his partner and that there was nothing to worry about. He told Harold to stay out of it. Terrified but determined to help, Sabrina provided investigators with the exact location of her uncle's house, hoping they could intervene before it was too late. By this point, law enforcement had gathered a significant amount of information about Michael Lee King, far beyond just his name. As more leads regarding Denise's whereabouts surfaced, a crucial call came in. Shortly after Sabrina's report at 6:30 p.m., Jane dialed 911 from her car. She recounted a chilling experience. While waiting at a traffic light, she heard terrifying screams coming from a nearby vehicle. The voice sounded young and desperate, repeatedly pleading for help. Jane managed to catch a glimpse of the driver and relayed his description to the dispatcher. She also noted that the car was a dark green Camaro. As the vehicles momentarily lined up side by side, she saw a hand frantically pounding against the passenger side window. Alarmed, Jane decided to follow the car. She stayed behind long enough to note the license plate, but it soon became clear that the driver had noticed her. In an attempt to shake her off, he began weaving erratically through traffic. Then, without warning, he made a sharp left turn, disappearing from sight. At that moment, Jane unknowingly crossed into Charlotte County, triggering a transfer of her emergency call to the local police there. What followed was a devastating misstep. Law enforcement agencies in Sarasota and Charlotte counties failed to communicate with each other. As a result, officers in Charlotte had no idea about Denise's abduction and weren't actively searching for her. Later that night, at 9:16 p.m. on January 17th, an officer on patrol spotted a green Camaro and immediately pulled it over. The driver was none other than Michael Lee King. Despite repeated orders to exit the vehicle, he refused until the officer warned that force would be used. When he finally stepped out, his appearance raised immediate suspicions. His jeans were soaked from the waist down, and his shoes were caked in mud. A quick search of the car revealed unsettling items: a powerless cell phone in his pocket, a muddy shovel in the back seat, and a gas can. Yet, there was no sign of Denise. Michael was arrested on the spot, and forensic experts combed through the vehicle for evidence. Their findings painted a grim picture: bloodstains, strands of hair ripped from the root, and a partial handprint pointed to a struggle. But it was one small object that removed any doubt: Denise's cherished heart-shaped ring, a gift from her husband on Valentine's Day, was found inside the car. She never took it off. The evidence was overwhelming, but Michael had his own version of events. During his interrogation, He spun a bizarre story, claiming he had been in a consensual relationship with Denise. According to him, they had been kidnapped together by masked gunmen who later took her away. He insisted he had no idea where she was. On January 19, 2008, the search for Denise came to a heartbreaking end. Authorities discovered her body, buried in a shallow grave, stripped of clothing. The devastating news crushed her family, who had clung to the hope that she was still alive. An autopsy confirmed their worst fears. Denise had been sexually assaulted and shot in the forehead, killing her instantly. Investigators also found her underwear nearby, containing traces of DNA that, when tested, matched Michael Lee King. The burning question remained. Why? Why did Michael choose Denise? They had no known connection, no prior encounters. What drove him to abduct her from her home, brutalize her, and end her life so violently? Prosecutors later pieced together what they believed had happened that morning. They argued that Michael had been lurking through the neighborhood, hunting for a target to satisfy his depraved urges. When he spotted Denise through her window, he saw an opportunity. Armed with a gun, he forced his way inside and threatened her. Initially, she resisted, but then he issued the ultimate threat: her children. If she didn't comply, he would harm them. Faced with an impossible choice, Denise sacrificed herself to protect them. On January 23rd, Denise was laid to rest in what became the largest funeral the city had ever seen. The procession was marked by a moving tribute. Fire trucks lined the streets with their lights flashing, and uniformed officers saluted as the hearse passed by. Rose petals were scattered along the route in her honor. Michael King stood trial on August 24, 2009. Predictably, he maintained his innocence. The prosecution, however, presented a mountain of damning evidence. The forensic findings from his car and the crime scene, the 911 calls, the suspiciously muddy clothing he wore the night of his arrest, and testimonies from multiple witnesses. His defense team tried to argue that Michael had no prior history of violence, painting him as a hard-working father who had simply lost control due to financial hardships. They also attempted to pin his actions on his cognitive impairments, citing the head injury he suffered as a child. Additionally, they questioned whether evidence had been mishandled or contaminated. But none of it swayed the jury. On August 28th, after just 2 hours and 5 minutes of deliberation, they returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on all charges, kidnapping with intent to commit a felony, sexual assault, and first-degree murder. Then on September 4th, at 2:45 p.m., the jury made their final decision. In a 12-0 vote, they recommended the death penalty for Michael Lee King. Despite multiple appeals, his conviction and sentence remained intact. Denise's family also sought justice in another way. They filed a lawsuit against Charlotte County authorities for negligence, citing the critical errors that had been made during the investigation. The case was settled out of court for over $1 million. Her husband, Nathan, used the money to buy a modest home for himself and their children, setting aside the rest in a college fund to secure their future. But Denise's legacy didn't end there. On April 24, 2008, the Florida legislature unanimously passed the Denise Amber Lee Act, aimed at improving emergency call operator training. However, participation was optional. Unsatisfied with this, her family continued advocating to make it a nationwide, mandatory program. By June of that year, they established the Denise Amber Lee Foundation, dedicated to enhancing emergency response systems and raising awareness about the dire consequences of untrained operators handling life-or-death situations. Denise's case underscored the importance of swift, coordinated action between law enforcement agencies and emergency services. It served as a sobering reminder that even a single failure in the system could cost an innocent life. Her tragic story became a catalyst for change, a push to ensure that no other family would have to endure the same devastating loss.